This is my true story. I spent my whole life sacrificing for my family. I worked quietly, gave up my own comfort, and carried their struggles as if they were mine. But when my health began to fade, they turned on me. They whispered that I was useless, too slow, and in the way. One night, they called me nothing but a burden. Those words cut deeper than any pain I had endured. They thought I had done nothing for them, but they didn't know the truth, a truth I had kept hidden for decades. Before I reveal what happened, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And please subscribe so that my story can reach more people. I look back on my life, and all I see are years of sacrifice that no one ever noticed. I was the one who rose before the sun and went to bed long after everyone else had fallen asleep. My hands carried the weight of their needs, cooking meals when there wasn't enough food, mending clothes so they would last another season, walking miles to work because bus fare was too expensive. I worked quietly behind the scenes, and I never complained, because in my heart, I believed that love was measured in what you give, not what you keep for yourself. My children thought their lives were built by their own strength, but the truth is, it was my shoulders that lifted them every step of the way. When money ran short, I took side jobs that no one ever knew about. I cleaned houses at night, stitched clothes for neighbors, and sold small things at the market just to bring in a few extra coins. Many nights I went to bed hungry so that my children could eat. They never saw me push my plate aside and tell them I wasn't hungry, when in reality I was starving. They never knew I pawned my wedding jewelry piece by piece to pay for their school supplies and fees. To them, it seemed as if things simply worked out. But they worked out because I sacrificed pieces of myself to make sure they had a chance at life. When debts piled high, it was me who quietly carried the burden. I remember sneaking to the pawn shop with my gold bangles hidden under a scarf, my heart breaking but my face steady because their future mattered more than my memories. I told myself it was just metal, just stones, nothing compared to seeing them walk into school with their heads held high. I remember staying up late sewing dresses for other women, my eyes burning from the candlelight, just to earn enough to pay off interest before collectors came knocking. My children never saw those long nights. They only saw the comfort I provided, never the pain it cost me. When they stumbled, I bailed them out. One borrowed too much money in college, another fell behind on rent, another wanted to start a small business. They always came to me when things went wrong, and somehow I always found a way to fix it. Sometimes it meant selling things I loved, sometimes it meant borrowing money in my own name, but I never told them how much it cost me. I never wanted them to feel guilty. I believed love was silent sacrifice, and so I carried it alone. Even the home they live in, the roof they brag about, was built with pieces of my sacrifice. They think their father's work alone made it possible, but it was my hidden savings, my quiet planning, and my endless worry that secured it. I made sure the bills were always paid, even when I had to choose between medicine for myself and tuition for them. I always chose them. Every time. I thought my silence was strength. I thought my sacrifices would one day be remembered with gratitude. I believed that when I grew old, when my back grew weak and my hands shook, they would remember the woman who carried them through storms. I believed they would look at me and see not a burden, but the very foundation of their lives. I thought the years of sacrifice would become my shield in old age, protecting me with their love. But I was wrong. They never saw the sacrifices, they only saw the results. And because I never demanded recognition, because I never told them how much I gave up, they grew blind to it. My silence became my erasure. In their eyes, I became nothing more than an old woman who sat quietly in the corner, no longer useful, no longer needed. They forgot that every comfort they enjoy was carved from my sacrifice. They forgot that behind their success was a woman who had given up her own dreams. I carried the weight of their lives on my back, but when my body grew tired, they dropped me like I was nothing. And that, more than all the hunger, all the labor, All the sleepless nights was the deepest wound of all. The signs of ingratitude did not appear suddenly. They crept into my life slowly, like a shadow that grows longer with the setting sun. At first, it was small things that I brushed aside, believing they did not matter. My children began to sigh when I asked them to repeat something I could not hear. They began to walk faster when we went out together, leaving me to struggle to keep up. They started speaking about me as if I were not in the room, their voices carrying impatience, as if my presence itself was a burden. I told myself it was nothing, that they were just busy, tired, caught up in their own lives. But in my heart, I felt the shift. As my health began to decline, their kindness grew colder. I noticed how quickly their tone changed when I asked for help. A glass of water, a hand to steady me, a ride to the doctor. Things so small, yet their eyes rolled as if I was demanding the impossible. They whispered to each other when they thought I could not hear, words like too slow and always in the way. I pretended not to notice, but those whispers cut deeper than knives. It was not my body that felt heavy in those moments, it was my heart. They began to measure me not by the decades I spent sacrificing for them, but by the inconvenience of my presence now. The same hands that once packed their lunches, mended their clothes, and wiped away their tears were now called useless because they trembled when I tried to hold a spoon. The same back that carried groceries through storms, that stood bent over sewing machines for hours, was now dismissed as weak because I could no longer lift a basket. They looked at me as if my worth had expired, as if age had erased everything I had given them. I still remember one afternoon when I tried to share a story from my past about how hard it was to keep the family afloat when their father lost his job. Instead of listening, they exchanged glances and smirked, as though my memories were foolish and unimportant. "That was a long time ago," one of them muttered, brushing off my words as if the foundation of their lives was just dust. They did not know that in those years of hardship, I had quietly worked myself to the bone, pawned my own belongings, and prayed every night that we would survive. They did not know because I never told them, and now they did not care enough to ask. Their homes were filled with comfort, their children went to good schools, and their careers flourished, all built upon sacrifices they had forgotten. I became invisible in the very lives I had helped create. I would sit in the corner of the living room during gatherings, watching them boast about their achievements to relatives and friends, never once acknowledging the woman who had quietly paved the way. I smiled to myself, pretending I was proud, but deep inside I was shrinking, fading into silence. The worst part was not their words, but their eyes. I saw it in the way they looked at me, not with love, not with gratitude, but with impatience. As if I was a problem they had to manage, a piece of furniture that took up too much space. I felt erased from their lives, reduced to an obligation rather than a mother. I told myself to endure it. I told myself that love was unconditional, that a mother's role was to give without expecting anything in return. I swallowed the humiliation, forcing a smile whenever they dismissed me, hiding the tears that burned behind my eyes. But each small act of ingratitude piled onto the next, until the weight of it pressed me deeper into sorrow. I began to realize that they had never truly seen me. They had seen what I provided, what I gave, what I sacrificed, but not me, the woman behind it all. And now that I could no longer give in the same way, they treated me as if I had nothing left to offer. That was when I understood. Their ingratitude was not new. It had been there all along, growing quietly like weeds in a garden, and I had ignored it because I wanted to believe in their love. But now, with every sigh, every whisper, every impatient glance, I could no longer deny the truth. The children I had poured my life into no longer valued me. And though I stayed silent, pretending not to notice, a fire began to grow in my chest. Because I knew something they did not. The truth about their success, a truth I had hidden for decades. The moment that broke me did not come with whispers or glances or quiet sighs. It came sharp and clear, like a knife pressed into my chest. It was one evening at the dinner table when I tried to help by serving food, even though my hands trembled. I dropped a spoon, and the clatter against the floor echoed in the silence of the room. I bent down slowly to pick it up, but before I could, my daughter snatched it away, her face tight with irritation. And then she said the words that cut deeper than hunger, deeper than exhaustion, deeper than every sacrifice I had ever endured. "You're nothing but a burden. You've done nothing for us." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The room seemed to tilt, and I felt the air leave my body. My own daughter, the child I had carried in my arms, the girl whose school fees I had paid with the last of my jewelry, the woman whose first home I helped secure by co-signing her loan, she looked me in the eye and said I had done nothing. My heart sank in a way I cannot describe. It was as if she had erased my entire life with one sentence. I wanted to speak, to remind her of the nights I went hungry so she could eat, of the endless hours I worked so she could study, of the tears I hid when collectors came knocking on the door and I found a way to send them away. I wanted to tell her that every brick of the house she now claimed as hers was laid because of my sweat and sacrifice. But the words would not leave my mouth. My throat burned, my chest ached, and my silence became my shield. If I had spoken, I think my voice would have broken into pieces. Around the table, no one defended me. My other children lowered their eyes, their silence as cruel as her words. I sat there, staring at my plate, the food turning to stone in my mouth. I felt erased, invisible, reduced to nothing in the eyes of the very people I had built my life around. Their father, if he had been alive, would have never allowed such words to be spoken. But he was gone, and I was alone, surrounded not by family, but by strangers wearing the faces of my children. That night, I could not sleep. I lay in my bed replaying those words again and again. "You've done nothing for us." They echoed louder than any thunder, burned sharper than any flame. I pressed my hands together, the same hands she had mocked for being slow and shaky, and I studied them in the darkness. These were the hands that had cooked for her, cleaned for her, worked for her, prayed for her. Every wrinkle carried a story of survival, every scar a reminder of sacrifice. And yet, in her eyes, they were worthless. The humiliation was heavy, but beneath it, something else began to stir, something stronger than sorrow. I realized I had allowed myself to remain silent for too long. I had hidden the truth of my sacrifices because I thought love would not require proof. I believed they would see it without me needing to show them. But love without memory is empty, and gratitude without truth is impossible. That night, lying in the dark, I knew one thing clearly. The time for silence was over. Her cruel words had torn open every wound, but they also awakened a fire I thought had died in me. They thought I was weak, finished, erased. But they did not know the truth I had carried in secret for decades. They did not know that behind every success they bragged about was my effort, my sacrifice, my hidden hand. And one day soon, I promised myself, they would see it. They would see everything. After that night at the dinner table, something inside me broke. I no longer tried to sit with them. Instead, I carried my plate to my room and ate alone, staring at the walls that seemed to close in tighter with every passing evening. The food always felt tasteless, heavy in my mouth, as though every bite carried the weight of humiliation. I replayed my daughter's words again and again. "You're nothing but a burden. You've done nothing for us." Each repetition was like a hammer striking my heart, reminding me of how small they believed I was, how invisible my sacrifices had become. In those lonely nights, I sat with my memories. I remembered the years when there wasn't enough food, and I gave up my own portion so my children wouldn't sleep hungry. I remembered the winters when I patched their clothes again and again, while I shivered in silence because I had no coat of my own. I remembered the days I carried heavy baskets from the market with aching arms, so they would never feel the shame of going without. Each memory rose before me like ghosts, whispering proof of my sacrifices, only to vanish when I compared them to the cruelty of the present. My heart ached as I realized how easily decades of labor and love could be forgotten. What hurt me most was not the words themselves, but the realization that they saw only the present, not the years that built it. They looked at me now, old and frail, and measured my worth by what I could no longer do, not by what I had already done. They saw wrinkles and weakness, but not the hands that once carried them, not the strength that once built the walls around them. They saw slowness, not the speed with which I once worked to pay their fees. They saw a burden, not the woman who had given up her life so they could call theirs successful. Night after night, I asked myself if silence had been my mistake. I had never told them about the loans I quietly paid off in their name, about the times I pawned my jewelry to save their futures, about the investments I made that later grew into their opportunities. I had kept my sacrifices hidden, believing love did not need receipts, that gratitude would live naturally in their hearts. But I was wrong. My silence had made them blind. My humility had turned me invisible. Those nights of humiliation carved something deep inside me. At first I cried, tears soaking my pillow as I whispered her father's name into the darkness, wishing he were still alive to defend me. Then the tears dried, leaving only anger. Not anger that burned wildly, but a steady, cold anger that gave me clarity. They thought I was powerless. They thought they had stripped me of dignity. But they didn't know the truth. I still had the documents, carefully stored away in a small box, bank receipts, deeds, contracts, proof of everything I had done, proof that behind every diploma on their walls, every house they claimed, every business they boasted about, there was me. My hands, my sacrifices, my hidden efforts had been the foundation of their lives. They could humiliate me with words, but they could not erase the truth I had carried all these years. So, in those nights of humiliation, sorrow slowly turned to determination. I promised myself that I would no longer remain silent. They had stripped me of respect, but I still held something stronger than their words: the truth. And one day, that truth would speak louder than all their cruelty. The truth was something I had carried quietly for decades, hidden in the corners of my life like a secret no one cared to uncover. My family walked proudly, boasting of their successes, believing they had built everything with their own hands. They spoke of their hard work, their cleverness, their determination, but they never knew that behind every one of their victories stood me, a silent figure who had sacrificed pieces of herself so they could rise higher. They never saw me in their triumphs, but I was always there. When my eldest son went to college, he thought it was his scholarship that carried him through. He never knew that the scholarship covered only part of the cost, and the rest was paid from the jewelry I sold quietly, the bracelets and necklaces that once held memories of my youth. I walked to the pawn shop with tears in my eyes, but a steady heart, because his future mattered more than my past. He wore his graduation gown with pride, but I wore my emptiness like a second skin. When my daughter bought her first house, she told everyone how smart she had been to secure a loan. She never knew that the bank had refused her at first, and it was my name that stood as co-signer, my small but steady savings that convinced them she was not a risk. I signed those papers quietly, never asking for thanks, only wanting her to have the stability I once dreamed of. She furnished her home with laughter and guests, never realizing the foundation beneath her comfort carried my signature. When my younger son stumbled in business, he thought luck had saved him when his debts vanished suddenly. He never knew it was me, paying the collectors behind his back, using the small inheritance from my parents that I had promised never to touch. I broke that promise to save him from shame, and I told no one. He told stories of resilience, of how he turned things around, but it was my sacrifice that gave him the chance to rise again. And when they all bragged about how they built their lives without help, I smiled quietly, swallowing the truth. Because love, to me, meant giving without demanding recognition. I thought love was enough. I thought they would remember without needing proof. But instead, my silence became erasure. They grew blind to the foundation beneath their lives, blind to the woman who had bled for them. The truth sat locked away in a box beneath my bed. Inside were receipts, deeds, letters, contracts, all the pieces of evidence they never saw. Bank slips showing the payments I made in their names. Pawn shop receipts for the jewelry I sold to cover tuition. Property deeds proving I co-signed their mortgages. Letters from banks acknowledging my investments that later grew into the wealth they claimed. Every paper was a silent witness to my sacrifices, to the invisible hand that shaped their success. They thought their empire was theirs alone. They thought their comfort was the result of their own effort. But without me, there would have been no empire, no comfort, no stability. They mocked me as a burden, but I was the very reason they had anything to boast about. For years, I told myself it did not matter, that love did not need acknowledgement, that a mother gives and forgets. But after hearing their cruel words, after being erased in front of my own eyes, I knew it was time. The truth could no longer stay hidden. If they would not give me respect from memory, then I would force them to give it through revelation. And so I sat alone, staring at that small box under my bed, knowing it held the power to change everything. The night they called me a burden was the night my silence ended. I went to bed with their words burning in my chest, replaying over and over like an open wound. You've done nothing for us. I stared at the ceiling, my body trembling, but not only from age, from rage. Rage mixed with grief, grief mixed with determination. For decades, I thought love was silent, that giving without asking for recognition was enough. But that night, I understood silence was no longer love. Silence had become permission. By saying nothing, I had allowed them to erase me, and I could no longer let that happen. I rose the next morning with heavy steps and went to the box I had kept hidden for years. The wooden lid creaked as I lifted it, and inside lay the truth they had never known. Receipts, letters, deeds, contracts, documents that carried the weight of my sacrifices. My hands shook as I touched them, not from weakness, but from the power I realized they held. Every piece of paper was a memory, proof of the times I gave everything for them. There was the pawn slip for my wedding bangles, sold to cover tuition when the scholarship fell short. I remembered standing in the pawn shop, the weight of the bangles leaving my wrist forever, but the weight of my son's future secured. There was the co-signer agreement for my daughter's first house, my signature written firmly at the bottom. I remembered the banker telling her no, and the way her face fell until I stepped forward with my name and savings to make it happen. There were the receipts from the debt collectors, proof that I had paid in secret so my younger son would not drown in shame. I remembered handing over crumpled bills, my stomach hollow from skipped meals, but my heart steady knowing I was saving him. As I held those papers, I wept, not from sorrow, but from release. For years, I had carried these sacrifices alone, never telling them, never demanding thanks. I told myself that was what mothers do. But now I saw clearly. They believed their success was theirs alone because I had hidden the truth that tied me to it. My silence had given them the illusion of independence. But now I would show them the reality. Their success was built on my back, and the proof was right here in my hands. I spent the whole day gathering the files, stacking them neatly into a folder. Each paper I placed inside felt like reclaiming a piece of my dignity. By the time I was finished, the folder was thick and heavy, just like the weight I had carried in my heart all these years. But now, that weight would no longer be mine alone. It would be theirs too. They would finally see what I had done for them. They would finally know who stood behind their lives, holding them steady when they were too blind to notice. That evening, I sat with the folder in my lap, staring at the door, waiting for the next family gathering. I knew the moment was coming, and this time I would not sit quietly in the corner, swallowing their cruelty. This time, the truth would speak. The turning point had come. The day of the family gathering arrived, and for once I did not feel small. I carried the folder with me, heavy in my hands, but heavier in meaning. As I walked into the living room, I saw them, my children and grandchildren, laughing, talking, boasting about their lives as though I was invisible. They sat at the table I had once saved for, with pawned jewelry, in the house I had helped secure with my name. They spoke of promotions, new cars, and investments, their voices filled with pride, but none of them glanced my way. I sat quietly, waiting, the folder resting on my lap like a secret ready to roar. When the meal was finished and the chatter grew louder, I cleared my throat. At first, no one noticed. My voice, after all, had long been something they ignored. But then I stood, pushing my chair back, and placed the folder on the center of the table. The sound of it hitting the wood cut through the noise, and silence fell. They stared at me, confused, some annoyed, as though I had interrupted something important. But then I opened the folder and began to spread the papers across the table. One by one, I laid them out. The pawn slips, the bank receipts, the co-signer agreements, the letters from debt collectors marked paid, property deeds with my name attached. Their eyes followed my hands as confusion turned to shock. I pointed at each one, my voice steady now. You called me a burden. You said I have done nothing for you. Look here, look closely. Every step you took was built on these sacrifices. At first, they tried to laugh it off as though I were exaggerating. But as they picked up the papers, as they saw signatures, stamps, dates, their faces changed. Pride drained into pale silence. My daughter held the deed for her house, her lips trembling as she read my name written beside hers. My eldest son stared at the pawn slip for my jewelry, realizing his education was bought with the gold I once treasured. My younger son froze with the receipts in his hands, his face turning red as he saw the payments I made to erase his debts. The room grew heavy. No one spoke. No one laughed. No one called me a burden. The air was thick with their guilt, with the truth pressing down harder than any words I could have spoken. For years, they thought their achievements were theirs alone. For years, they erased me, pushed me aside, dismissed me as useless. But now, with every paper, every line of proof, they were forced to see the truth. Their success was not theirs alone. It was mine too. Built on my sacrifices, carried on my shoulders, hidden in my silence. I looked at them, my children who once lowered their eyes in shame when I asked for small help, my grandchildren who whispered that I was too slow. Now their eyes could not meet mine. Some had tears, others had shame, but none of them could erase what was on the table. I did not need to shout. I did not need to cry. The truth was louder than any insult they had thrown at me. I told them calmly, "You called me nothing. You called me a burden, but without me, none of this would exist. Every roof over your heads, every diploma on your walls, every comfort you brag about, it is all tied to me, and tonight you will remember that." The revelation was not just in the papers. It was in the silence that followed, the silence of recognition, of shame, of guilt. For the first time, they saw me not as a fragile old woman, but as the foundation they had trampled. For the first time, they realized that the burden they mocked was the very reason they could stand tall. And in that moment, I felt my dignity return. The room after my revelation did not feel like the same room I had walked into. Just minutes earlier, it was filled with noise, laughter, and arrogance. Now it was heavy, still, and suffocating with shame. My children and grandchildren sat frozen, staring at the papers scattered across the table, their pride crumbling before their eyes. The silence was almost painful, broken only by the sound of the clock ticking on the wall. For once, I did not feel like the burden in the room. I felt like the weight that pressed on their hearts. My eldest son was the first to speak. His voice trembled as he asked if the pawn slips were real, if I had truly sold my jewelry for his tuition. I looked him in the eyes and nodded. He lowered his head, his hands covering his face as he began to weep. For years, he had boasted about how hard he worked to achieve his degree, how he had done it with determination alone. Now he saw the truth. His determination had been carried by my sacrifice. My daughter clutched the property deed, her knuckles white. She could not meet my eyes. The same woman who had called me nothing but a burden now sat pale and silent, realizing the house she so proudly decorated, the home where she hosted guests and showed off her success, was not hers alone. It carried my name, my effort, my silent hand. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Her pride had turned to ashes and her arrogance to dust. My younger son stared at the receipts of his erased debts. His face burned with shame, his lips quivering. He had always told stories of resilience, of how he had faced everything alone. But now, the truth stared back at him in black ink. His survival had been paid for with my hidden sacrifices. He dropped the papers onto the table and buried his head in his arms, unable to look at me. Around the table, my grandchildren shifted uncomfortably, their eyes wide with disbelief. They had grown up hearing their parents boast about their achievements, never realizing that their grandmother had been the one holding everything together in silence. Now they saw me differently, not as the frail old woman who moved too slowly, but as the reason their lives had been built on stability. Their faces carried confusion and shame, as if they were suddenly seeing me for the very first time. Some begged for forgiveness, their voices breaking, their pride gone. Others sat frozen in silence, unable to speak, unable to face what the truth had revealed. For years they had treated me like I was in the way, like I had contributed nothing. Now, confronted with undeniable proof, they could no longer hide behind their arrogance. They had to face the fact that every step of their journey had been tied to me. I did not raise my voice. I did not scold. I simply sat in my chair, calm and steady, as they unraveled before me. Their shame was louder than any words I could have spoken. I had carried humiliation quietly for years, and now it was their turn. The weight of truth pressed down on them, and there was no escape. For the first time in decades, I felt dignity return to me. I was no longer invisible. They could no longer erase me, no longer dismiss me as useless. They knew now who had stood behind their lives, who had built their foundation, who had carried them when they thought they had risen on their own. The truth had spoken louder than their cruelty. The fallout of that night did not end at the table. It stayed with them, followed them into their homes, haunted their pride. They could never look at their successes the same way again. And that was enough for me. After that night, nothing in my family was the same. The papers I laid on the table could not be unseen, the truth could not be undone, and the shame in their eyes could not be erased. They tried in the days that followed to return to normal, but normal no longer existed. My children who once spoke with arrogance now spoke with hesitation. Their voices were quieter, their words weighed with guilt. For the first time in years, they looked at me not with impatience, but with fear. Fear of the truth I had revealed, fear of the woman they had called a burden, but who turned out to be the foundation of everything they had. Some tried to fix it with apologies. They came to me one by one, their heads lowered, their voices soft, as though speaking to a judge who had already passed sentence. My eldest son cried as he asked for forgiveness, his pride broken. My daughter, the one who had called me nothing but a burden, tried to serve me food at the table, her hands trembling as though she was afraid to meet my eyes. My younger son avoided me for days before finally standing in front of me, unable to speak, his shame spilling out through his silence. They all wanted forgiveness, but their apologies came not from love, but from guilt. And guilt is not love. I listened to their words, but I did not let them erase the years of humiliation I had endured. Words are easy. It is easy to say, "I'm sorry," when the truth leaves you no choice. But where were their sorries when I ate alone in my room? Where were their sorries when they whispered about me being too slow, too weak, too useless? Where were their sorries when I cried quietly in the night, remembering all the sacrifices they had forgotten? Their apologies came too late. The damage was already carved into my heart. So I made a decision. I gathered the folder again, this time not to reveal the past, but to secure the future. I went to my lawyer, carrying the documents and my will. I rewrote everything. I made it clear that the wealth, the investments, the properties, the things they once assumed would automatically be theirs, would not go to those who had treated me with cruelty. I directed my inheritance to charities, to people who had shown me kindness, to causes that would carry my love into the world long after I was gone. The rest I left only to those few relatives who had still respected me when everyone else forgot. I did not do it with anger. I did it with clarity. My family needed to learn that betrayal has consequences, that neglect carries a cost, that cruelty cannot be washed away with late apologies. I signed my name at the bottom of those papers with steady hands, feeling a peace I had not felt in years. The same hands they once called weak and useless had written their justice into ink. When the news reached them later, I saw the shock in their faces again. They had expected me to forgive, to fold back into silence, to give them everything in the end as though nothing had happened. But instead, they saw that my silence was gone forever. They realized that their future, the one they assumed I would hand to them, had been rewritten. And this time, they had no power to change it. The aftermath was heavy in our home. They walked on eggshells around me, their arrogance gone, their entitlement broken. For once, I was no longer invisible. I was no longer the weak old woman they dismissed. I was the truth they had ignored, the foundation they had erased, and the justice they could never escape. And in that knowledge, I found peace. Justice, for me, did not come in loud voices or dramatic scenes. It did not come with revenge shouted in anger or tears spilled on the floor. It came quietly, with steady steps and calm choices, the way I had lived my whole life. For years, I gave in silence. For years, I sacrificed without asking for recognition. For years, I carried the weight of their comfort while they walked freely. And when they finally called me a burden, when they erased everything I had done, I thought my story would end in humiliation. But it did not. My story ended in truth. I began to live differently after that night. I no longer lowered my eyes when they dismissed me. I no longer sat in silence when they spoke as if I wasn't there. I looked at them directly, knowing they could never erase me again. The truth sat in every corner of the house now, in the papers that revealed my sacrifices, in the memories that could no longer be denied, in the shame that lingered in their voices. They could not undo what I had shown them, and they knew it. The power they once thought they had over me was gone. The will I rewrote became my final statement. I did not do it with cruelty. I did it with fairness. I gave to those who had given to me, the charities that cared for women like me, the neighbors who had shown kindness, the few relatives who had still remembered to treat me with dignity. And I took away from those who had given me nothing but humiliation. My children, who once saw me as a burden, would inherit nothing from me, nothing but the memory of their cruelty, the silence of my absence, and the knowledge that they had destroyed their own inheritance with their own words. And that was justice enough. I found peace not in punishing them, but in freeing myself. No longer did I feel trapped by their opinions or broken by their neglect. I sat in my chair with dignity restored, knowing that the truth had spoken louder than their insults. I was not a burden. I was the reason they had anything to boast about. Every success they carried had my fingerprints on it. And though they tried to erase me, they could not erase the foundation I had built. Now, in my final days, I no longer feel invisible. I no longer feel worthless. I feel strong in a quiet way, knowing that I chose to reveal the truth, to stand up after years of silence, to remind them who I was. They thought I would leave this world broken and forgotten. Instead, I will leave it on my own terms, with my dignity intact and my justice secured. Final thought. They called me a burden, but I was the reason they ever had anything to boast about, and they'll never forget it.